I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Michael Knox, and I'm the Chief Economist and Director of Strategy of Morgans Financial. Morgans Financial is the largest stockbroking firm in Queensland. We have raised about 90% of the capital in Queensland. 10th largest stockbroker in the country. We have 60 branches around Australia, and probably by far Australia's largest private client stockbroking firm, although we have a lot of institutional clients as well. And like I say, we raise the overwhelming majority of all of the capital in the state. Now, about myself, I was born at a very early age, and then I became in Queensland, and then I became interested in economics. And because I was interested in economics, I became an Australian Trade Commissioner. And my first posting was in the Middle East. So to prepare for my first posting, I lived on the desert road to Alexandria. And I lived in a place called Jolliville, which was in Giza, near the foot of the pyramids. And I used to walk down from Giza to the Mina House Hotel, which was at the foot of the Cheops Pyramid, and myself and my wife would hire horses. And in the morning, we would ride around the pyramids and then give the horses back, and then walk back to our hotel and learn Arabic. And we did that for 4 months of our lives. Absolute hell. Don't know how I put up with it. I then took up a position as in the Australian Embassy in Saudi Arabia and lived there for 2 years, worked there for 2 years, and of course for that reason I became a Middle East expert. So I went back to Canberra, and because of my background in the Middle East, I was immediately put into a policy area to do with the European Union, and became a policy officer in the European Union. And after a couple of years of really learning about that and writing econometric pieces about European Union agricultural and economic policy, that was regarded as a prime qualification for me to become the Australian Trade Commissioner in Jakarta. So I then did that for 2 years. Those who have a public service background will understand the ultimate logic of this career progression. So after a couple of years in the embassy in Jakarta, I came back here and did some postgraduate work and got into stockbroking, and my life has obviously been downhill ever since. On my downhill path, 5 years ago I became president of the HR Society of Australia Queensland Division, and did that for 4 years before giving the job in March last year to somebody who was actually intelligent and competent, who has been doing that job ever since. Now, Adam asked me to speak at this and said, well, what are you going to talk about? And I said, well, you've just asked me, I have no idea. And he said, well, I'll give you the provisional title of, since you're an econometric forecaster, and I have to confess that I was, we will give you the econometric forecaster's outlook for the 2 million person job target. And I said, well, I'll come back to you with what I'm actually presenting with the paper I'm actually presenting in a couple of weeks' time. So I went back a couple of weeks later and sent out on the slides, Australia in Queensland in great recession, but I delight the fact that Adam has introduced me under the working title rather than the paper I actually sent him. So tragically, what I'm actually going to talk about today is Australia and Queensland in the Great Recession. And what I'm going to look here is the structure of the employment growth, and how structural change has been, what the pressure is that drives structural change, and what the result of that structural change is in the Australian economy and the Queensland economy, and really the example of Queensland, why I have Queensland in the presentation at all, apart from the fact that we're here in Queensland, and I actually did this presentation in the Premier's Department and they liked it, is really Queensland as an example of a mining state. And what you see is a lot of the structural things that are happening in the broader Australian economy are happening in Queensland in spite of the fact that it is one of the 2 major mining states. Now, the first thing that you find is if you look at what is generating a lot of the structural pressure for structural change is what's happening in Australian unit labour costs. That here we have a pretty little chart which we've drawn from the OECD, and we can see the OECD as the green line, and we see that unit labour costs have been gradually going up, and we see the euro area, which we know is has all of these structural issues in the euro area as the red line, and it's going up a little bit higher than the OECD, and the US is slightly higher than that in unit labour costs, but by far the highest. And the least competitive of all these economic areas is Australia, and the Australian labour market. Isn't that wonderful? And that is, of course, because the terms of trade has forced up the real exchange rate, and as well as that, there has been a strong level of domestic demand because of the high level of rising terms of trade, high level of increase in national income, and that has generated strong demand forces in the labour market, which has meant that unit labour costs have risen to a level far beyond any concept of international competitiveness for the Australian economy. Now, my personal little way of explaining this to general presentations that I do is to compare two little locations. I have a friend from Battery Park City, which is in downtown in New York, visiting me at the moment. And not far from where he lives in downtown and Battery Park, there is one of my favourite little restaurants in the world for historical purposes. And it's called Francis Tavern, and it's at the bottom of downtown in Manhattan. It is the oldest building in Manhattan. It was built in 1716, Francis Tavern. It's 5 stories, 2 stories are underground, 3 stories above ground. At the 2 top levels are a museum to the Revolutionary War. Middle level, just above ground, is a restaurant, Francis Tavern restaurant. Now this is a block away from JP Morgan. This is the real financial district. Now this is no low rent area. Okay. And I love going to dinner there. I love going to dinner there because you've got, you don't just have a selection of food, you have a selection of international wines, and you can pretty much satisfy, it's a for me a fine dining experience. The building itself, Francis Tavern building, was this tavern was firstly the site of the farewell dinner, this room that you eat in, a farewell dinner by George Washington to his general staff at the end of the Revolutionary War, first thing about it. Secondly, this tavern building was the first ever building of the United States Treasury when it was under Alexander Hamilton. As I say when I take guests there, thank God they didn't start it in a brothel. Okay, so my friend from New York is visiting me, and we go to a restaurant called the Stokehouse, which is a New York state type, US state type restaurant, and it's at South Bank. And the price per person, when adjusted to the same currency, is twice as much per person as in Francis Tavern in downtown, the financial district in New York City. And this really is my personal demonstration, is just, the whole country's totally uncompetitive. However, I'm a forecasting macroeconomist, and I think that the real solution to this is, well, of course it would be good if you could solve the problem in the labour market, but really what's going to happen is the real exchange rate is going to collapse in the next 2 years. So I'm forecasting that the Australian dollar, which is 93 cents today, is going to be 80 cents by the end of the year and 72 cents within 3 years. And that's in a quarterly presentation I do to financial institutions. I've got a whole bunch of econometric modelling which backs up that view. So that's how I think you get back to equilibrium. But the result of this very uncompetitive market on an international level generates an enormous level of structural change. So and it's also it's helped being one of the things which has generated a growth recession. Now, growth recession is an American term, really, in macroeconomics. I'm a macroeconomist and an international financial economist. That's my background. I'm not a labour market economist at all. And a growth recession is what happens when growth is macroeconomic term for what happens when growth in employment is not enough to take up growth in the labour force, and the result of that is unemployment goes up. And really what that happens, growth recession happens when employment growth is below trend, and in Australia, average employment growth this century is about 2.1% per year, and in the last, up until 2 months ago, it was 0.71%, so it was a third of the long-term average, so that is a growth recession, and in the last 2 months of recovery, it's driven all the way up to 0.8% as opposed to 2.1. So Australia is in a growth recession. How do we get into a growth recession? I went to a presentation by Ken Henry 2 years ago, and what happened was the previous government feared that we would be going into a mining construction boom, word correctly. And they feared that when you look back at the previous mining construction boom, which was in the 1950s, what happened is that mining construction boom generated enormous upward pressure on wages, enormous upward pressure on inflation. And so what they attempted to do, both at a federal level and an RBA level, was deflate the Australian economy going into that mining construction boom. And Ken Henry, at a presentation I went to 2 years ago in Melbourne, said what we have to do is make the rest of the economy feel lousy so that we can generate enough excess resources in terms of the labour market and the capital market to be able to supply enough resources to allow the mining construction boom to happen. And he was incredibly successful. The economy feels rotten. It feels lousy. This is a triumph of policy. And the struggle is now to get employment back up to some kind of normal growth level. Because what actually happened was, as a result of this, they tightened fiscal policy, monetary policy was, the RBA was running a cash rate of 475 basis points, whereas now it should have been 2.5%, where it now is. And so monetary and fiscal policy was too tight, and so the economy slumped. And you've got this very high real exchange rate, and you've got the unit labour costs, which are hopelessly non-competitive. They did the job. They had all of the things there that they needed to screw the pooch, and they did it. So, but this is just turning around off the ground. In Queensland, we hit bottom, because of the tightening by the state government about a year earlier when it came to office. So actually, employment growth in Queensland is now more than twice as fast as the Australian economy. And what's aiding this is the recovery of residential construction in Queensland. Now these are the sectors of employment, and construction is the biggest in Australia, and that's not really residential. That's the engineering construction, followed by healthcare, followed by manufacturing. Manufacturing is still the third largest employment sector, even though it hasn't added a job in 30 years. Professional and scientific services, followed by the retail trade, followed by public administration and safety and education, then transport, finance, then tourism, then the wholesale trade, then mining, which is only 3%, in spite of being a big chunk of about 8% of GDP, only employs 3% of people, and then you've got agriculture. But what's interesting is the change. What is the result of this structural change and putting a whole bunch of the parts of the economy out of a job by making it non-competitive? Well, really interestingly, healthcare is the biggest sector of employment in Australia, followed by mining. Now, you'd sort of think that mining would be, and it is, because of the mining boom, the mining construction boom. But in spite of this, healthcare is still the strongest sector of employment. So that when you have government policy, for example, that doesn't subsidise a dying industry like motor vehicle manufacturing and subsidises a number one growing industry called healthcare, gee, I think that's intelligent policy. What can I say? I actually think that's intelligent policy. Followed by professional and scientific services, followed by education and training, public administration and safety. In spite of everything that happens, the public service is still the fifth biggest boom industry in the Australian economy in the last 5 years. Isn't that reassuring? Isn't that reassuring? Followed by construction,
Financial and insurance services, well, I have to make a living somehow. Administrative support services, which is outsourcing, by the way. It's not another form of public administration. Administrative support servicing is outsourcing. Electricity, then the retail trade, and the wholesale trade, and manufacturing. So the two, what you see here, is the biggest, well, a couple of interesting things. First, of course, that manufacturing, even though it's big, is the biggest loser in employment. Mining is one of the biggest rising sectors of employment. Well, that makes sense. But also, what you see is that the big losses in agriculture. And big losses in agriculture, the number of jobs in agriculture are almost exactly the same as the job gains in mining. And the way I explain that to audiences is I say, well, people in agriculture drive heavy equipment. And people in mining drive heavy equipment. So what you've got is people in agriculture who can drive heavy equipment going where they're paid more to drive the same heavy equipment. Now what you see in the recent data is they're shifting back. But we'll see that, particularly in Queensland, when we get to the Queensland part of the presentation. So let's look at 1 year. And the healthcare sector is still the strongest growth industry, but now, hey, this boom industry called public service is the second biggest boom industry in the economy, up until the budget. Yes, why did the budget have to happen? And then electricity, gas and water, construction is growth. Finance, those stalwart people in the financial sector are finally getting a job. I think that's totally fair. And what you see here is that as opposed to the chart we saw before, agriculture is starting to gain employment. So you see 5,000 jobs in agriculture in the last year. And we look at mining, and we see that mining is flat. Okay, so what we're seeing is just the beginning of that movement of those jobs, that employment growth, back to agriculture from mining. I mean, like, they're taking jobs which are for far less money, but they're jobs. Okay? And also, if I do what I do is I do a 90-page quarterly macroeconomic presentation, including a whole lot of commodity modelling. And what I show in that is that we really are moving into an area where agricultural commodities are going up in price. Like the wheat price in US dollars has gone up 40% in the last 6 months in US dollars. At the same time as the iron ore price has gone down, the wheat price has gone up. Wheat is our major single largest agricultural export. Feed prices are also going up 50% in the next year. So you do have a terrific lift in agricultural export prices at the same time as these mining commodity prices are going down, and that is shifting, is capable of shifting at least some jobs from the mining sector back to the agricultural sector. Okay, we go down the list, and what's really interesting here is retail trade. Retail trade is positive jobs, wholesale trade. Anyway, we'll just go down. Manufacturing continues to lose jobs, and outsourcing lose jobs. And let's get Queensland and compare that to the rest of it. Well, the really interesting thing about Queensland is that how similar it is as a mining state, one of the two biggest mining states, how similar it is. That the biggest growth sector in Queensland is healthcare. Just like, and this is private sector healthcare, this is not public sector healthcare. This is, and I explain this, and I say, I am a gentleman of a certain age, and I am using healthcare services that I didn't used to use 5 years ago. I go to a podiatrist, I go to a physiotherapist, I go to a dietitian. I have fancier dentists than I have. I mean, I use a whole bunch of things to improve my lifestyle and extend my lifestyle that I didn't use before, and this is increasing demand. Also, there is a competitive advantage in the Australian economy. That if you look at, for example, the Irish population, which talks a lot, they have a high number of, incredibly high number of Nobel Prizes for literature. in their population, in the Irish population. If you go to Germany and you want to be a really if you're a really intelligent kid, you become an engineer. If you're an Australian and you're a really intelligent kid and you avoid, God is really nice to you and you avoid becoming an economist, you become a doctor. And so we have this cultural emphasis on healthcare, and we have strong growth in demand for healthcare. Okay, public administration and safety, even in Queensland, the public sector has been a boom industry. Third biggest with mining, professional and scientific services, education and training. And the interesting thing here is, one of the really interesting things is the wholesale trade. See, wholesale trade has added jobs in the last 5 years, and the retail trade has lost jobs, lost 17,000 jobs. Now, how can that happen? How can that happen in a place as strange as Queensland? Retail is storefront, bricks and mortar retail. And how can wholesale be gaining jobs, whereas retail be losing jobs? Because obviously wholesale distributes stuff to retail to sell. But what this shows is that sales are not being made through bricks and mortar retailing, they're being sold online. So you see higher growth in the wholesale sector employment than retail, and that is the effect of online. And in Queensland, I did this presentation last year, similar presentation last year, to a group at the annual strategy session of the Local Government Council, Local Government Association, and they said, gee, in regional areas in Queensland, this is booming, this online retail. But in the last year, we look at it again, we see in Queensland, healthcare still at the top. So in all of these sections, healthcare is at the top. This area that has been subsidised in the most recent budget strategy is up the top. So, I mean, that's smart. Manufacturing is rising. Like, you don't understand in manufacturing. Electricity generation is manufacturing. And what's growing in manufacturing is we're not making Maseratis in Queensland, tragically. I wish we were. What we're doing is we're refrigerating gas. And that is included, that generates an increase in manufacturing. And then you have recovery in retail trade, finally, electricity, gas and water. Mining is growing, and that's in my presentation. Do I have any questions? I'm sure I've used all of the time and some, but any questions before I... yes, that very intelligent man over there in the back row.
Thanks for your talk, John Osborne, Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. My question is about the recent budget. Tough or soft? Is there a budget crisis or not? And what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I have an extremely good piece which I wrote about this on Tuesday night, which I should clearly show to you and send to you. So give me your card before I'm allowed to leave the room. Yes, I regarded the budget. I said in my second line budget, I said it was PG-rated horror. But I said it was an austerity budget for people who were unable to read budget paper number one. I noted that the level of expenditure, the level of expenditure on welfare this year actually goes up by 7.6%. In the forthcoming year, in this terrible, vicious year in which we destroy social welfare, spending on social welfare is the largest sector of increase and goes up by $7.6 billion. I noted that as a percentage of GDP, the level of government spending for the next 4 years is above the level of government spending as a percentage of GDP in the Wayne Swan, the 12-13 budget. The 12-13 budget that Wayne Swan did at that time, which in turn is dramatically higher than the level of spending as a percentage of GDP, which was in the last year of the Howard government. So as I said, if spending in the next 4 years is above the Gillard Swan budget at 12-13, this is a budget of PG-rated horror. This kind of horror that you see in cartoons on Saturday morning. I'm happy to send you the piece. Yes, sir?
Right.
Des, you're going to talk endlessly to me later.
Right, Michael, I really enjoyed that presentation. In particular, it struck me your view that the dollar's going to go down to 70 cents in about 3 years.
72, yeah.
Oh, okay. 72.5, no doubt.
0.34, let's cut here.
Okay, relating to the day, what would be the ramifications in terms of employment with this? What's going to change? Remind us, I can't remember when it was down that bloody low before, and there's going to be a fairly significant change over probably a 3-year period. What's going to be the ramifications to the labour market, and how's it going to affect?
Oh, well, I'm not a labour market guy, as I pointed out. Macroeconomically, it improves the positions of import competing industries. So a lot of money's been made by importers and import finance as the real exchange rate has gone up. So import financing and importing, goes off, and import competing improves. And of course, as I was pointing out in terms of commodity forecasts, if agricultural prices are forecast to rise, if beef and wheat prices are forecast to rise in US dollar terms as they are, then they're going to go a hell of a lot higher in Australian dollar terms, and so you're going to have a significant agricultural boom if you're prepared to take advantage of it over that period, over the next 3 to 4 years.